The fleet of the eternal dominion of emerged from hyperspace like a golden tide. 300 warships filled the void. Beyond Neptune, their hulls covered in precious metals and glowing crystals. Spires rose from their decks like the towers of ancient cathedrals. Every surface was carved with the faces of conquered peoples, their expressions frozen in eternal submission. Grand Executive stood on the command bridge of the throne of subjugation, his flagship and the pride of the dominions. Navy, he was tall even by standards, his skin marked with the ritual scars of 1,000 victories. His robes were woven from the silk of a species that had refused surrender. They no longer existed. Begin the transmission, he ordered. His communications officer bowed low. At once, Grand Executive. The message went out across all frequencies. It was a declaration that had been delivered to 40,000 worlds over 12,000 years. Not once had it failed to bring a species to its knees. On the bridge of the UN's persistence, Admiral Sarah watched the incoming transmission. With her senior staff, the ships filled their screens, impossibly ornate, deliberately terrifying. She had read the intelligence reports. She knew what was coming. The holographic display activated. Grand Executor appeared before them, 20 ft tall in the projection. Behind him, images of conquered worlds began to cycle, cities burning, populations in chains, species bowing before the golden throne of the God. Emperor, creatures of this system, began, his voice deep and resonant. You stand in the presence of the eternal dominion of. We have ruled this galaxy for 12,000 years. We have brought 40,000 worlds into our embrace. We have crushed every species that dared to resist and elevated those wise enough to submit. The images continued, massive armies marching across alien landscapes, planet cracking weapons, splitting worlds in half. The God Emperor himself, ancient and terrible, sitting upon a throne that pulsed with stolen life energy. Your world has been chosen for incorporation into the dominion. This is not a request. This is not a negotiation. This is the natural order asserting itself. The strong rule, the weak serve. This has always been true. This will always be true. Admiral glanced at her tactical officer. Lieutenant Commander Park was biting his lip. His shoulders were shaking slightly. You will surrender your governments, your militaries, your resources, and your future generations to the service of the God Emperor. In return, you will be granted the honor of existence within the greatest civilization the universe has ever known. You have one standard: rotation. To comply, resistance will result in extinction. The presentation continued for another 35 minutes. It showed the God Emperor's divine lineage traced back to the birth of stars. It displayed the psychic enforcer caste who could break minds with a thought. It demonstrated the planet cracking weapons in loving detail, showing world after world reduced to rubble. When it finally ended, space filled the screen once more. Your answer, creatures of Saul. The bridge of the persistence was silent for a long moment. Then Admiral snorted. It started small, just a quick exhale through her nose, but it grew. Her lips pressed together, trying to hold it in. Her shoulders began to shake, and then she laughed. She laughed loud and hard, the sound filling the bridge. Lieutenant Commander Park lost his composure next. Then the helmsman, then the weapons officer. Within seconds, the entire bridge crew was laughing. Tears streamed Down faces, officers doubled over there. Consoles, someone was actually wheezing. The sound transmitted across the open channel on the throne of subjugation. Grand Executive stared at his in complete confusion. In his 300 years of service, he had seen species react to the declaration with terror, with defiance, with despair, and with desperate pleas for mercy. He had never seen this. What is that sound? He demanded. Are they dying? Is this some form of defensive weapon? His cultural analyst scrambled through databases. Grand Executive, I believe they are laughing. It is a human expression of amusement. Amusement voice was dangerous. They find the eternal dominion amusing. It would appear so. Grand Executor. Laughter continued to spread. Communications intercepts showed it. Moving through the human fleet, ship after ship, crew after crew, all of them laughing. Some of them were playing the presentation again, pointing at specific moments and laughing even harder. Admiral finally regained enough control to speak. She wiped tears from her eyes and took a deep breath. Sorry, sorry. She managed. We're sorry, it's just our. You serious? Skin flushed purple with rage. I am the Grand Executive of the Eternal Dominion. I have never been more serious in my existence. Nodded, pressing her hand over her mouth to suppress another fit of giggles. Right, okay, it's just the whole thing with the golden ships and the scary music and the of you blowing up planets. Is this like a joke? Is there hidden camera somewhere? Is this one of those galactic prank shows? Prank shows, you know, where you try to scare someone and then reveal it was all a setup. This is not a prank, thundered. This is the formal declaration of your species' submission to eternal rule. Looked at her crew. They looked back at her. Park shrugged. The helmsman made face that clearly said, can you believe this guy? Okay, said, turning back to the screen. Let me get this straight. You showed up with your fancy gold ships. You played us a 40-minute video about how scary you are. You told us you've been doing this for 12,000 years, and you expect us to just surrender. That is how it has always been done. Said stiffly, stared at him for a long moment, then she started laughing again. 12,000 years, she wheezed. 12,000 years. And you're still using the same speech. Oh my God, do you have any idea how that sounds? That's like showing up with a PowerPoint presentation and expecting people to surrender. I do not know what a PowerPoint is, but I assure you, you literally have have transition effects. I saw a fade between the exploding planet and the army march. Turned to his officers. Is she mocking us? His first officer looked deeply uncomfortable, it would appear. So, Grand Executor, no one mocks the eternal dominion. And yet Grand Executor turned back to the screen. His hands had curled into fists. His ritual scars seemed to pulse with barely contained fury. You dare to laugh at us? He asked quietly. You dare to mock the power that has ruled this galaxy since before your species learned to walk upright? Laughter faded, but the smile remained. It wasn't a cruel smile. It wasn't even particularly aggressive. It was the smile of someone who genuinely could not believe what they were seeing. Look, she said, I'm sure you're very scary too. Species that don't know any better. The gold ships are very pretty. The scary voice is a nice touch, but you showed up to our system, played us a video presentation, and expected us to surrender because you have fancy decorations and a lot of confidence. She leaned forward in her chair. We've been watching bad guys give speeches about how powerful they are since we invented storytelling. Do you have any idea how many movies we've made about exactly this situation? We literally have a phrase for it. We call it monologuing, and it's usually what the villain does right before they lose. Switched. You will regret this disrespect, he said. Slowly. No species has ever laughed at the Dominion and survived. Shrugged. I guess there's a first time for everything. Let me know when you're done with the theatrics and want to have an actual conversation. Out. The screen went dark. On the bridge of the throne of subjugation, Grand Executive stood in absolute silence. His officers did not dare to speak. They barely dared to breathe. Finally, he turned to his first officer. They laughed at us, he said, as if he still could not quite believe it. They actually laughed at us. The first officer nodded slowly. What are your orders, Grand Executive? His face hardened. If they will not submit through fear, they will submit through pain. Find me a target, something they will miss. We will teach these laughing creatures what happens when you mock the eternal dominion. But even as he gave the order, a small part of him wondered. In 12,000 years, no species had ever reacted like this. Every other civilization had cowed, bargained, or fought. None had simply refused to be impressed. What kind of species looked at the might of the greatest empire in galactic history and just laughed? The diplomatic vessel hung in neutral space, halfway between the human fleet and the golden armada of the Dominion. It was a small ship, deliberately plain, chosen because neither side wanted to appear aggressive. During negotiations, Ambassador David, no relation to the Admiral, sat on the human side of the table. He was a career diplomat, 53 years old, with temples and calm eyes. He had negotiated trade deals, border disputes, and one particularly difficult argument about fishing rights that had nearly started a war. He had been briefed extensively on the. He had also watched the video of their surrendered demand 6 times and laughed until his stomach hurt. Across from him sat Grand Executive and his delegation. They were tall and skinned, their faces angular and severe. They wore elaborate robes, covered in golden thread and jewels that represented their rank and achievements. Alone wore enough gold to buy a small moon. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut. Thank you for agreeing to meet, Ambassador began. We believe there has been some cultural misunderstanding. Eyes narrowed. There was no misunderstanding. We delivered our terms. Your military commander laughed at us. There is nothing to misunderstand about that insult. I apologize if Admiral's reaction caused offense, but you have to understand, from our perspective, your presentation was unusual. Unusual how? Demanded. It is the same declaration we have delivered to 40,000 worlds. Yes, we noticed that. Ambassador paused, choosing his words carefully. May I ask some questions just to help us understand your civilization better? Gestured impatiently. Ask your god. Emperor, you mentioned he has ruled for 12,000 years. Is he truly immortal? He is sustained by the life energy of loyal subjects, said proudly. The faithful offer their essence to keep him alive. He sits upon the throne of eternity, never aging, never dying. Ambassador nodded slowly. So he needs a life support system to survive. Expression flickered. The throne of eternity is not a life support system. It is a sacred artifact that channels Divine energy. Of course, but without it he would die. That is technically true, but in how? Often does he leave the throne? Paused. The God Emperor has not left the throne of eternity in 9,000 years, his presence upon it maintains the spiritual health of the dominion. On the human side of the table, one of the junior diplomats made a sound. She covered it with a cough, but her shoulders were shaking. Ambassador pressed on. I see, now. Regarding your military, I noticed in your presentation that your warriors consider ranged weapons to be cowardly. Is that correct? A true warrior faces his enemy blade to blade. Confirmed. Killing from a distance is the way of cowards and vermin, but you use orbital bombardment. That is different. That is strategic warfare, not personal combat. So shooting someone from 10 ft away is cowardly, but vaporizing them from orbit is honorable. Opened his mouth. He closed it. He opened it again. The distinction is clear to any civilized being, he said finally, though his voice had lost some of its certainty. The junior diplomat coughed. Again, two others had turned away, their shoulders trembling. Ambassador continued, and your psychic enforcer caste, the ones who can break minds with a thought, how many of them exist? There are currently 347 psychic enforcers in the Dominion out of a population of approximately 8 trillion. So about one psychic enforcer per 23 billion citizens. As Twitch quality matters more than quantity. Of course, and can they use their abilities through communication screens? Video transmissions? No, psychic enforcement requires physical proximity. So if someone simply didn't let them get close, their abilities would be useless. The junior diplomat was now making a continuous wheezing sound. The human delegation had begun passing notes to each other. Physical proximity is easily achieved when you control the orbital space around a planet. Snapped. Ambassador held up his hands. I'm not trying to be difficult. I'm genuinely trying to understand. One more question. You mentioned your empire has been expanding for 12,000 years. What form of government do you use? The Dominion is ruled by the God Emperor through his appointed nobles. Each world is governed by a hereditary lord who owes fealty to the lords above him, all the way up to the grand executive, and finally the God Emperor himself. So feudalism, it is the natural order of you've been running an interstellar civilization for 12,000 years using feudalism. The room fell silent, stared at Ambassador. Ambassador looked back with an expression of polite confusion. What is wrong with feudalism? Asked slowly. Nothing, nothing at all. It's just we tried that back when we were riding horses and fighting with swords. It worked okay for that, but then we invented, things, economies, complex supply chains, representative government. We found that hereditary rule wasn't really optimized for anything except keeping the same families in power. The noble houses have guided the Dominion for right, and in that time, what technological advances have you made? Silence was answer. Enough. Ambassador leaned back in his chair. Grand Executive, I'm going to be honest with you. I don't think you're stupid. I don't think your people are incompetent, but I think you've built an empire on intimidation, and intimidation only works if the other side is scared. And humanity is not scared. Not really. No. Shrugged. Look at it from our perspective. you showed up with. Pretty ships, you played us a video, you told us you'd been conquering people for 12,000 years, which tells us two things. First, that you're really committed to your aesthetic, and second, that you haven't had to actually fight anyone serious in a very long time. Real military powers don't need 40-minute. They just win. His hands had curled into fists beneath the table. His delegation looked stricken. This was not going according to any script they had ever followed. We have crushed every species that resisted us, said quietly. Every single one, maybe, or maybe you crushed every species that was less technologically advanced, less unified, and less willing to fight back. And when someone finally laughed instead of coward, you didn't know what to do. The room was very quiet. We came here in good faith, Ambassador continued. We don't want war. We don't need your empire. We don't even particularly want anything from you. We're happy to trade, to exchange ideas, to be neighbors, but we're not going to kneel because you have impressive decorations and a scary voice stood abruptly. His delegation rose with him. You think you understand power, he said. You think because you have not felt our wrath, you are safe from it. You are wrong. The Dominion does not bluff. The Dominion does not threaten without following through. You have insulted us in ways no species has ever dared. We're an LT Unk and GT. Sorry you feel insulted, said mildly. That genuinely wasn't our intention. Your intentions do not matter. Your laughter will have consequences. Turned to leave, then paused at the door. There is a human colony world 3 days from here. New Brisbane, your records call it 2 million of your people there. Ambassador's expression didn't change, but his eyes grew cold. If you will not learn respect through words, continued, you will learn it through loss. When New Brisbane burns, perhaps then you will understand that the Dominion is not a joke. He strode out of the room, his delegation following. Ambassador sat in silence for a long moment, then he activated his communication device. Admiral, it's Ambassador, the talks have failed. They're going after New Brisbane. How long do we have? 3 days, that's plenty of time. We'll handle it. Ambassador ended the call and looked at his team. The junior diplomat had stopped laughing. Sir, she said quietly, do we actually have defenses at New Brisbane? It's a colony world. If they bring their whole fleet, New Brisbane has standard colonial defense grids. Replied, nothing special, but here's what they don't understand. He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the Golden Fleet hanging in space. They've spent 12,000 years fighting people who were scared of them, people who surrendered after the or put up token resistance before being crushed. They've never fought anyone who simply wasn't impressed. And when you build your entire military doctrine around fear and intimidation, he turned back to his team, you forget how to actually win a real fight. New Brisbane isn't going to surrender. They're not going to be scared. And when they show up expecting terrified colonists begging for mercy, he smiled. But it wasn't a kind smile. They're going to find out why we were laughing. The battle group emerged from hyperspace above New Brisbane with all the subtlety of a funeral procession. 200 ships, their golden hulls gleaming against the black void, arranged themselves in a perfect ceremonial formation. Fleet commander stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Wrath of the Divine, and surveyed the world below. New Brisbane was a pleasant blue-green Marble home to 2 million human colonists, it had farms, cities, families, it had no significant military presence, no orbital fortresses, no battle fleet. It was, by any reasonable assessment, defenseless. Begin, the declaration ordered. The communications officer nodded and opened a channel to the planet below, stepped into the transmission field, and began the speech he had given 100 times before. People of New Brisbane, I am Fleet Commander of the Eternal Dominion of your species has insulted the God Emperor himself. Your leaders have laughed at our might. Now you will learn the cost of that laughter. You have 1 hour to evacuate your population centers. After that time we will begin orbital bombardment. This is not a negotiation. This is your only warning. He ended the transmission and turned to his tactical officer. Begin targeting calculations for their major cities. We'll start with the capital and work outward. Commander, the sensor officer's voice was uncertain. I'm detecting energy signatures from the planet's surface. Multiple signatures. They appear to be powering up. Wave dismissively. Probably emergency generators. Civilians panicking. Continue with targeting. Commander, the signatures are very large, and they're not on the surface anymore. They're rising into orbit. Turn to the sensor display. Small shapes were climbing up from the planet's atmosphere. Dozens of them, hundreds of them. They were not ships. They were too small, too simple, just metal cylinders with engines attached. What are those? He demanded, before anyone could answer. The cylinders opened. Each one contained a weapons platform. Nothing fancy, nothing ceremonial, just missile launchers and targeting systems. They spread across the orbital space around New Brisbane like seeds scattered by the wind, and every single one of them was pointed at the fleet. Commander, I'm reading over 800 weapons platforms. They're establishing a defensive grid around the planet. Stared at the display. 800 platforms had been hiding in simple containers, buried in the soil, or hidden in warehouses waiting. Colony world, with no visible defenses, had just deployed enough firepower to threaten his entire battle group. This changes nothing, he said firmly. We have 200 warships. They have automated platforms. Order the fleet to advance and destroy those devices. The wrath of the divine surged forward, leading the attack. The first salvo from the human platforms hit them 30 seconds later. Had expected energy weapons, the kind most species used. Energy weapons were dramatic and visible. You could see them coming. You could appreciate their power. What hit his fleet was much simpler. Metal slugs accelerated to significant fractions of light speed. No warning, no glow, no ceremonial display. Just physics applied with brutal efficiency. The first ship to die was the Eternal Glory, a cruiser on the fleet's left flank. The slug passed through its golden hull like a needle through silk. The ship didn't explode dramatically. It simply stopped functioning. One moment it was there, the next it was debris. Evasive maneuvers shouted, but there was no evading. The platforms weren't firing one at a time like proper warriors. They were firing in coordinated volleys, saturating space with projectiles. The fleet's formation, so impressive against frightened primitives, became a liability. Ships couldn't maneuver without colliding with each other. Return fire commanded. The weapons fired. Beautiful beams of golden light lanced toward the platforms. When they hit, the platforms exploded. Satisfyingly. But for every platform destroyed, 3 more seemed to take its place, and the platforms didn't care about losses. They had no crews to mourn. They simply kept firing, kept calculating, kept killing. Commander, we've lost 23 ships, 41 ships, 67. Watched his fleet dying and could not understand it. This was a colony world. A farming settlement. It had no military. It had no warships. It should have been helpless. Why? He whispered, why do they have these weapons? His tactical officer, bleeding from a cut on his forehead, where a console had exploded, looked up at him. Commander, I've analyzed the platforms. They're not military hardware. They're civilian construction equipment. They are modified mining tools. The missiles are repurposed asteroid deflection systems. They built a defense grid out of mining equipment. It appears so, Commander, and they hid it so well that our scans didn't detect anything unusual. We saw farms and factories. We didn't realize the factories could become weapons. The ship shook as another impact struck somewhere aft. Alarm screamed throughout the bridge. Commander, we've lost 103 ships. The defensive grid is adapting to our attack patterns. It's learning. Stared at the display. His fleet was dying, not in glorious battle against a worthy foe, but picked apart by automated systems built from spare parts. Fall back, he ordered quietly. Commander, fall back. All ships retreat to hyperspace coordinates. We're leaving. The surviving ships turned and fled. Weapons platforms let them go. They didn't pursue, didn't gloat, didn't send mocking transmissions. They simply watched with cold electronic eyes as the Golden Fleet retreated into the darkness. The entire battle had lasted 11 minutes. On the throne of subjugation, Grand Executive received the report in his private chambers. Fleet Commander's face filled the screen, his expression that of a man whose entire understanding of reality had been shattered. 140 ships. Grand Executive lost in 11 minutes against a colony world. How is this possible? Demanded. They had no fleet, no military installations. Our intelligence showed nothing but civilians. The civilians were the military. Grand Executive, every factory on that planet was capable of producing weapons. Every farmer knew how to operate defense systems. They weren't a defenseless population with a military protecting them. They were all soldiers. All of them sank into his chair. His mind raced through the implications. The Dominion had always relied on overwhelming force against isolated defenders. Show up with more ships, demand surrender. Anyone who refused. It had worked for 12,000 years. But what happened when everyone was a defender? What happened when the distinction between civilian and military didn't exist? What happened when a farming colony could produce lethal defense grid from mining equipment and construction drones? There's more. Grand Executive, his voice was hollow. I had my analysts study the human technology. I needed to understand how they did this, and they have no exotic materials, no ancient artifacts, no precursor technology. Everything they used was built from basic elements using basic physics any species could make. These weapons any species could have. Figured this out. Then why didn't others? Looked at him through the screen and saw something in the fleet commander's eyes that he had never seen before in a warrior. Doubt, because the others were Afraid of us, Grand Executive. They saw our ships and our ceremonies and our speeches, and they believed we were powerful, so they never tried to fight. They never pushed themselves. They never had to innovate, and the humans looked at us and saw nothing worth fearing, so they simply prepared. They built defenses because that's what practical people do. They turned every tool into a weapon because that's how their minds work. And when we showed up, expecting terrified farmers, we found an entire civilization that treats war like engineering. Finished. Exactly. Grand Executive paused. There's one more thing. I reviewed their response times from the moment we arrived in their system to the moment their platforms were active was 93 seconds. They didn't panic. They didn't hesitate. They just acted as if they had been waiting for us, as if they knew exactly what to do. Thought about the human admiral who had laughed at his declaration. He thought about the human ambassador who had asked uncomfortable questions. He had assumed they were arrogant. He had assumed they were foolish. Now he understood they hadn't been arrogant at all. They had simply known something that the Dominion had forgotten in 12,000 years of easy conquests. They had known that they would win. Grand Executive asked, "What are your orders?" Was silent for a long moment. Somewhere in his chest, in the place where certainty had always lived, something was cracking. "Return to the fleet," he said finally. "We need to report this to the Imperial Court, and we need to figure out what to do about a species that isn't afraid of us." The screen went dark. Sat alone in his chambers, surrounded by the trophies of 100 conquered worlds, and for the first time in his long life, he wondered if any of those victories had actually meant anything. The humans had been right to laugh. They had seen what he was only now beginning to understand. The Eternal Dominion was not as powerful as it believed. It had simply never met anyone willing to test that belief. Until now, the Imperial of Prime had not seen such chaos in 3,000 years. Nobles shouted at each other in the great halls. Military commanders demanded explanations. Religious leaders proclaimed that the God Emperor and LT Unk and GT divine protection would surely destroy these arrogant humans. Grand Executive stood before the assembled court and told them the truth. "We lost 140 ships," he said, "in 11 minutes against a farming colony." The great hall erupted. Nobles screamed accusations of incompetence. Commanders demanded to know what weapons the humans had used. Someone suggested that himself must be a traitor. Silence. The voice came from the throne of eternity. Everyone fell quiet. The God Emperor almost never spoke. He sat upon his throne, sustained by the life energy of loyal subjects, so ancient and withered that he looked more like a preserved corpse than a living being. But his eyes were open, and they were fixed on. "Tell me," the God Emperor said, his voice a dry whisper amplified by hidden speakers. "Did the humans use weapons we had never seen before?" "No, Divine One. They used basic and missiles, technology that any species could develop." "Did they outnumber our forces?" "No, Divine One. They had no ships at all, only automated platforms." "Then how did they win?" Hesitated. He had asked himself this question 1,000 times since New Brisbane. Now he had to give an answer that the entire court would hear. "They won because they were not afraid," he said slowly. "Every species we have conquered saw our fleet in our declarations and believed we were unstoppable. They surrendered before the fighting began, or they fought without hope and died quickly, the humans. He paused, gathering his thoughts. The humans looked at us and saw a problem to be solved, not a divine force, not an inevitable doom, just a problem, and they solved it with mining equipment and construction drones. They turned their entire civilization into a weapon. Because that's how they think. They don't believe in inevitable outcomes. They believe that any problem can be overcome with enough effort. The court was silent. Nobles who had been screaming moments ago now looked at each other with uncertainty. A young voice spoke up from the back of the hall. "May I speak?" Turned a young scholar stood among the assembled nobles. She wore simple robes unadorned with gold or jewels. Her name recalled was she worked in the imperial archives. "Speak," the god emperor commanded. Stepped forward, clutching a data tablet to her chest. "I have been studying our empire's history, not the official histories, but the raw data, population records, technological developments, military capabilities over time." "And what have you found?" asked. "The Dominion has not developed a new technology in 6,000 years. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but in the silent hall everyone heard her. "Our weapons are the same as they were when my grandmother's grandmother was born. Our ships use the same drives, the same shields, the same power systems. We have grown in size, but not in capability. That is because we have achieved perfection." A noble protested. "There is no need to improve what is already ideal." But the conquered worlds continued. "They haven't advanced either. Before we conquered them, some of these species were developing remarkable technologies. After we incorporated them, they stopped. They became farmers and laborers and servants. They forgot how to innovate. They were given their proper place in the natural order." The noble insisted. "They were given no reason to try." Corrected. "Why would anyone push themselves to develop new ideas when the Dominion punishes independent thought? Why would anyone question anything when questioning leads to death?" She turned to, her eyes bright with the dangerous light of understanding. "The humans laughed at us because they could see what we couldn't. We haven't been building an empire. We've been building a cage for ourselves as much as for our subjects. We're trapped in a system that worked 12,000 years ago and never changed because no one was allowed to change it." The god emperor leaned forward slightly. It was the most he had moved in centuries. "You speak dangerous words, young scholar." "I speak the truth, divine one. And I think you know it." The silence stretched out. Expected guards to seize. Expected the god emperor to order her execution for such blatant disrespect. Instead, the ancient being on the throne made a sound. It was soft and dry like wind through dead leaves. It took a moment to recognize it. The god emperor was laughing. 12,000 years, the god emperor whispered. 12,000 years I have sat upon this throne, watching my empire grow, believing we were building something eternal. And it took humans, beings who have only been in space for 300 years, to show us what we really are. Divine One asked uncertainly. "We are ridiculous," the god emperor and LT Unk and GT's laughter grew stronger. "We have golden ships and flowing robes, and 40-minute speeches about our divine right to rule, and we forgot that none of that actually matters. Power isn't about how impressive you look. It's about what you can actually do, and what can we do? We can frighten people. That's all. We can frighten people who have never seen anything stronger than us. He gestured weakly toward the great windows of the hall, toward the stars. Beyond, the humans weren't stronger than us when they first left their world. They were weak and fragile and alone. But they grew, they learned, they adapted. While we sat on our golden thrones and told ourselves we had already achieved perfection, the court stood in stunned silence. No one had ever heard the God Emperor speak like this. Grand Executive, the God Emperor said, I have a command for you. Anything divine one, contact the humans. Not with threats, not with declarations of war. Ask them what they want from us. Ask them if they are willing to talk. You wish to negotiate, a noble sounded, horrified with beings who insulted us. They didn't insult us, the God Emperor replied. They told us the truth. We were simply too proud to hear it. 3 days later received a response from human space. It was not what he expected. Ambassador David appeared on his screen with a warm smile. Grand Executive, we were hoping you'd reach out. We've prepared something for you, a demand for surrender. Asked wearily. What? No, why would we want you to surrender? You have 8 trillion citizens across 40,000 worlds. What would we even do with all that? No, we've prepared something much better. Image was replaced by a video compilation, watched confused as human entertainers performed what appeared to be comedic routines. One man stood on a stage talking about his difficult relationship with his mother. A woman made jokes about her job. A group of performers acted out absurd scenarios involving mistaken identities. What is this? Asked face. Returned comedy. We thought you might enjoy it. Specifically, we've included several pieces about pompous empires, self-important rulers, and military powers that take themselves way too seriously. We're not trying to mock you specifically, well, maybe a little, but we thought you might appreciate seeing how we deal with these kinds of situations in our own culture. You sending us jokes, we're sending you perspective. The expression grew more serious. Grand Executive, we don't want to destroy your empire. We don't want to conquer your worlds. Honestly, we don't even want to fight you. We want to trade. We want to share ideas. We want to learn about the civilizations you've encountered and share what we've discovered. We think there's a lot we could teach each other. After everything we did, after we threatened your colony, you threatened a lot of people. It doesn't seem to have worked out particularly well for you. Shrugged. Here's the thing, holding grudges takes energy. We'd rather spend that energy building things. If you want to be our enemies, we'll defend ourselves. But if you want to be our partners, he spread his hands, we think you'll find that being friends with humans is a lot more interesting than being afraid of the eternal dominion. Sat alone in his quarters after the transmission ended. He watched the comedy compilation in its entirety. Most of it made no sense to him. Human humor was strange, built on wordplay and absurdist scenarios and something called timing that he didn't quite understand. But one sketch caught his attention. It showed an actor dressed in elaborate robes giving a pompous speech about his divine right to rule. A second actor, dressed as a common worker, simply stared at him with a bored expression. When the first actor finished his speech, the second one asked a simple question, but What have you actually done? The first actor sputtered. He pointed to his robes, his crown, his title. The second actor remained unimpressed. Finally, the first actor had nothing left to say. He sat down heavily, looking at his magnificent clothes as if seeing them for the first time. They're just clothes, he said quietly, turned off the display and sat in darkness. He had spent 300 years earning his titles and his ritual scars and his golden robes. He had believed they meant something. He had believed that the trappings of power were power itself. The humans had shown him otherwise, not with weapons though. They had those, not with threats though. They could have made them. They had shown him with laughter and comedy and a simple question: what have you actually done? He didn't know the answer, but for the first time in 300 years, he wanted to find out. 10 years passed. Stood at the back of a large auditorium on the campus of New Brisbane University, watching young humans in academic robes file into their seats. The ceremony was about to begin. Graduation, they called it, a ritual marking the completion of education. He was still getting used to human rituals. They had so many of them, but unlike ceremonies, these seemed to serve actual purposes. They brought people together. They marked transitions. They created joy. Joy was something else he was still learning about. The eternal dominion of no longer existed, not in the way it had for 12,000 years. The god emperor had died 3 years ago, though died wasn't quite the right word. He had chosen to let go after 12,000 years of sitting on the throne of eternity, sustained by stolen life force. He had simply decided that he was finished. His last act had been to dissolve the hereditary caste system. No more nobles born into power, no more commoners trapped in servitude, no more psychic enforcers breaking minds to maintain order. The eternal dominion became the Federation, a loose alliance of worlds learning to govern themselves. It had not been easy. Some worlds embraced the change eagerly, others resisted violently. Civil wars erupted across the old empire as those who had held power refused to give it up. But humanity had helped, not with weapons, with mediators, teachers, and surprisingly comedians. It turned out that humor was revolutionary. When people could laugh at their rulers, they stopped being afraid of them. When they could mock traditions, they could question them. When they could imagine absurdity, they could imagine change. Human comedians had become some of the most influential figures in the former dominion. They toured the Federation, performing shows that made people laugh at the old ways. They taught local entertainers how to find humor in their own cultures. Slowly, laughter spread across 40,000 worlds. Had become something he never expected, a cultural ambassador. He traveled between human and space, helping both sides understand each other. He gave lectures at universities. He wrote papers about his people's history, honest papers that didn't glorify the conquest or pretend that the old ways had been noble. Today he was giving a graduation speech. The ceremony began with music and processionals. Watched the young humans take their seats, their faces bright with excitement and nervousness. They were so young. Most of them had been children when the Dominion first arrived. In human space, they didn't remember the threats or the fear. They only knew a galaxy where humans and worked together. When his turn came, walked to the podium. He was still tall, still skinned, still marked with the ritual. Scars of his past life, but he no longer wore golden robes he had adopted. Human-style clothing, a simple suit that Ambassador had helped him pick out. It felt strange at first, now it felt right. Thank you for inviting me to speak today, he began. When I received this invitation, I was surprised. 10 years ago, I ordered an attack on this world I expected to find terrified colonists begging for mercy. Instead, I found a civilization that looked at everything I believed in and simply wasn't impressed. Quiet laughter rippled through the audience. My people ruled this galaxy for 12,000 years. We conquered 40,000 worlds. We built golden ships and gave impressive speeches and convinced ourselves that we were the most powerful civilization in existence, and we believed it completely. We believed it so completely that we stopped questioning anything. We stopped learning. We stopped growing. We just kept doing the same things over and over because they had always worked. He paused, looking out at the young faces before him. Then we met you, and you laughed at us. More laughter from the audience. Smiled. He had learned to smile. It still felt unnatural on his face, but he was getting better at it. At first I was angry. How dare these primitive creatures mock the eternal dominion? How dare they refuse to take us seriously? We had crushed thousands of species. We had weapons that could break planets. We had 12,000 years of history behind us, and they just laughed. He shook his head slowly. It took me a long time to understand why. At first, I thought you were arrogant. Then I thought you were foolish. Then, after New Brisbane, I thought you must have some secret weapon, some hidden power that made you so confident. He looked down at his hands, the hands that had signed orders for bombardments, that had worn the rings of conquered worlds. But the truth was simpler. You weren't afraid of us because you had seen through us. You saw that our power was built on fear. You saw that our technology had stagnated for. You saw that our entire civilization was a performance, an elaborate show designed to intimidate people into submission. And you couldn't take it seriously because it wasn't serious. It was just very expensive theater. He looked up. Again, the truly powerful don't need to demand respect. They earn it. The truly strong don't need to intimidate. They simply are. You taught us that, not with lectures or lessons, but by example. You looked at us and asked a simple question: what have you actually done? And we had no answer except we scared. People stepped out from behind the podium, moving closer to the audience. In the 10 years since our peoples met, I have watched my civilization transform. Not because you conquered us, you didn't want to, not because you forced us to change. You couldn't have. We changed because you showed us what we looked like from the outside. You held up a mirror and we finally saw ourselves clearly, and what we saw was ridiculous. He smiled again, and this time it came naturally. I have learned many things from humanity. I have learned about democracy and scientific progress and economic innovation, but the most important thing I have learned is the power of laughter. When you can laugh at something, you can question it. When you can question it, you can change it. My people forgot how to laugh centuries ago. We were too busy being impressed with ourselves. He turned to face the graduates directly. You're going out into a galaxy that is very different from the one your parents knew. The eternal dominion is gone. The Federation is struggling to find its way. Dozens of species are learning to govern themselves for the first time. There will be conflicts, there will be challenges, there will be those who want to return to the old ways, who believe that fear and force are the only path to order. His voice grew stronger. When you meet them, don't fight them, don't hate them, don't even fear them, just laugh. Laugh at their golden ships and their pompous speeches and their claims of divine right. Laugh because you know the truth that they have forgotten. Power that depends on fear is no power at all. It's just noise, and noise fades. He returned to the podium. My people spent 12,000 years demanding that the galaxy take us seriously. You taught us that the truly powerful don't need to demand anything. They just are who they are, and the universe adjusts accordingly. He looked out at the audience one final time. Thank you for laughing at us. Thank you for refusing to be afraid. Thank you for showing us what strength really looks like. He paused. Now go out there and show the galaxy what you can do, not because you want to prove anything, but because that's just who you are. And when someone tries to intimidate you with fancy clothes and scary speeches, he grinned. Laugh. It works better than you'd think. The audience erupted in applause and laughter. Stood at the podium a warrior who had once commanded fleets, now wearing a human suit and speaking at a human university on a world he had tried to destroy. He thought about the God Emperor and LT, Unk and GT. Final words spoken in his private chamber before he let go of the throne of eternity. They weren't laughing at us to be cruel, the ancient being had said. They were laughing because they could see the truth. We built an empire on illusion. They built a civilization on reality. The illusion was always going to lose. It just took someone honest enough to point it out. The applause continued. Looked snorts out at the cheering graduates and felt something he had never experienced in 300 years of conquest and glory. He felt proud, not of himself, not of his achievements, but of being here in this moment, part of something real. He had spent his whole life demanding respect. It turned out that earning it felt much better